Hello to everyone from the Native Court Workers and Counselling Association of BC. It's Cindy Blackstock and Spirit Bear here, joining you from unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa. First, we want to send our prayers and thoughts to everyone affected by the fires in British Columbia, and particularly to First Nations who have lost their homes and are continuing to try and recover from the rediscovery of the children buried in residential schools throughout the province. This is a very important time to be holding your gathering, because it ought to be a time to bring us all together for action on the solutions that are already on the books. I want to begin by remembering that the inequities in federally funded public services have been known since at least 1907, when Canada's own Chief Medical Health Inspector came to look at the children in residential schools across Canada. His name was Dr. Bryce, and what he found is that the children were dying at a rate of 25% a year, 50% if you track the children over 3 years. The causes? Canada was spending far less money on health care for, quote, Indian children back then, and terrible healthcare practices like putting children sick with TB in with healthy kids. They were malnourished children. There was poor ventilation in what the Ottawa Evening Citizen called veritable hotbeds of disease. That's what they called residential schools. His findings were covered by the national media, and for a while Canadians paid attention, including one, a lawyer named Samuel Hume Blake, who said that in the Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. But when the headlines died, sadly so did the children, because the public turned away and the Canadian government continued to choose to fund the inequities and perpetuate the poor health conditions. As we try to reconcile with honoring these children who have been found in these graves in residential schools, and as we remember the work plan that the survivors left to us in the TRC calls to action, we must remember this ongoing pattern of the government knowing better, having solutions to remedy the injustices, and choosing not to do it. And so as you gather and you talk about the solutions that you have on the books, talk at least as much, if not more, about the implementation on the solutions that have been put forward by your members for generations. I am working right now with First Nations communities, as well as First Nations children, young people, and children of all diversities, to try and pressure the Canadian government to implement a 2016 legal decision finding that Canada's ongoing discrimination in federally public services is creating harms to children, separating children from their families at numbers that exceed residential schools, and sadly contributing to the deaths of some children. It feels like in many ways it's a recycling of the same situation that Bryce would have seen, because the harms that these children are experiencing are often preventable, and the harm doer is often the federal state and the provincial governments that choose not to fully implement the many solutions that are on the books. Fortunately, due to 19 non-compliance and procedural orders since 2016, Jordan's Principle is now a lived reality for many children across this country. First Nations children on and off reserve are entitled to receive the public services they need when they need them in Jordan's name. So you can access Jordan's Principle. Just go to 1-855-JP-CHILD and call that phone number when you have a professional's note, or it can be an elder or knowledge keeper in the case of cultural services, and the guardian's permission. There's been close to 1 million services and products given out in Jordan's name, but we're still very concerned about the red tape that's been put into Jordan's Principle, and some things are being denied when they ought to be approved. For First Nations Child and Family Services, we finally, after 28 years, have prevention services for First Nations agencies, and they're starting to roll them out. There's also the Act respecting First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, but it's important for all of you to understand that the federal government does not see itself as bound by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders if a First Nation draws down jurisdiction. What does that mean? That means that Canada doesn't feel it has a legal obligation to meet the non-discrimination requirements in the legal orders in an enforceable way. That worries us at the Caring Society. We published a series of information sheets for First Nations to consider about funding under that piece. Because self-determination is so important, it ought not just be in name only. And what we're concerned about is we're seeing the federal government replicate many of the discriminatory patterns that eventually led to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case in First Nations child welfare. The other thing we're doing is, of course, we're continuing our work with children. And to that end, we have a TRC's child-friendly version of the calls to action. And you can unload this on our website in English and in French. And we've also got a series of books that Spirit Bear writes, and all the proceeds go to children's reconciliation projects. This one is really quite timely. It talks about monuments, what to do about it, how do we learn about the past, and it begins right there in BC, in the territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt, with the removal of John A. Macdonald's statue in front of Victoria City Hall. And then talks about how do you learn from the past, and eventually it ends with the story of Dr. Bryce, yes, the same public health officer who blew the whistle in 1907, and how he is now being recognized in Beechwood Cemetery with a historical plaque. The other thing that's happening at Beechwood, and you can learn more through this book, Spirit Bear Echoes of the Past, is we've actually got other historical figures buried there, including Duncan Campbell Scott, who many of you know was the man who said no to Dr. Bryce. Both he and Prime Minister Laurier chose to go down a direction that would directly contribute to the deaths of these kids. And so Duncan Campbell Scott, now has a new plaque that says Confederate poet, because he was, but also cultural genocide. You see, when we talk about this telling of history, we need to tell the full story, but we also need to understand that not all legacies are equal. And in the case of Duncan Campbell Scott, his role in residential schools far eclipses anything that he did in the poetic movement. So I wish you all the best in your coming days of your event. I wish I could be there with you in person. I send good energies from all of us at the Caring Society, and I'm looking forward to working with you to make the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and of course the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls calls to justice, a lived reality. Let's make sure that we do everything that we can, because every little kid is worth the effort, and every little kid is worth the money. Thank you.